I'm Sarah Fitzsimmons. I'm the Director of Restoration with the American Chestnut Foundation, and I work out of here at Penn State in our partnership office. Today we've got Tom Saielli, who's going to be talking about finding wild American chestnuts. Because he's out in the field, I'm sure you guys can see that, because he's out in the field, I'm going to be advancing his slides for him. So I'm going to work on getting that set up. And let me see if there's anything in the Q&A. Yes, if you want to make a comment, actually, if you want to make a comment, throw it in the chat. If you have a question, throw it in the Q&A. That's about the best way to do it. Right. Hi, Frank. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Lisa Thompson, who is the President and CEO of the American Chestnut Foundation, and have her tell you a little about what we're doing and turn it over to Tom.
Sounds good. Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. Is this the 7th Chestnut Chat, Sarah? I think it is. We've had some great turnout for it. Looks like we're getting about 65 participants coming on, attendees, and we really appreciate your engagement during this challenging time. Most of us are still working at home, but as you can see, Tom's getting out in the field. You can't keep him away from the woods for too long. He is now a 10-year veteran. Does that sound right, Tom? Of the American Chestnut Foundation.
Something like that.
One of our most positive and energetic chestnutters out there, and he has taught a lot of us about field identification, and he's a great naturalist along with a wonderful chestnut planter and grower. So we're gonna have a treat today to have Tom's skills and enthusiasm come across the airwaves to all of us. So with that, thank you again for coming. We're still plugging away mostly at home. You can see I'm in my upstairs guest bedroom. Sarah's still working at home. We're trying to stay safe and vigilant throughout this pandemic. So we just appreciate everyone just sticking with us through this time. We're in the middle of our spring appeal. We're getting some really nice gifts in, which is critical to a small nonprofit like us. So thank you to those of you out there that have already donated to our spring appeal. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tom Saielli. Take it away, Tom.
Thanks. Thanks, Lisa and Sarah. And thank you, everybody who's on the call. Actually, I'm at home too. I'm in woods behind my house here in just outside of Charlottesville. I'm on some trails that if I wanted to, I could ride my bike and be in downtown Charlottesville in about 10 minutes. I work in an office here in Charlottesville during normal times. My office is located at the Virginia Department of Forestry. And it's a great place to work. And I manage I'm the Mid-Atlantic Regional Science Coordinator. So I manage Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and Kentucky. And I formerly was the Southern Regional Science Coordinator. And lately I've been helping out down there with a lot of my old friends. And before that, I was up in New England with Kendra Gurney and Paul Schauberg getting my master's degree at University of Vermont, studying American chestnut. So I have been doing this for a little while. And one of my favorite parts of the job is to go out in the woods and search for American chestnut. Not just a not just a job, it's also a hobby. When I'm not on the clock, I'm still out in the woods. Often with my family, and when we go hiking, I'm still always looking for American chestnuts. And over the years of studying this, I've learned some tips for how to find American chestnut, and I'd like to share those with you today. So first slide, Sarah. The first thing to talk about is our reasons for wanting to find American chestnut. Now, if you're on this Chestnut Chat today, you probably already have a pretty good idea that the work we do relies on finding those surviving American chestnuts out there. And there's a few specific reasons. Obviously, we need to use those American chestnuts in our breeding program. We like to call that the 3-burr breeding program. That's breeding, biotech, and biocontrol. And even the biocontrol work with hypovirulence requires having American chestnuts to do the research on. But the breeding work, of course, we need American chestnuts. We've used them for all the traditional breeding we've done so far. And of course, nowadays, we're really trying to push Phytophthora resistance in the program. And we want to do that at the chapter level. And in order for that to be successful, we need to have American chestnuts to breed into that. We have new sources of phytophthora resistance that we've been incorporating into the program. We have graves, we're studying new lines. A lot of the screening work is being done in Asheville. And before that, a lot of the work was done at Joe James. And that screening program allows us to find sources of resistance, but those have to be bred with Americans so that we have diversity and local adaptation. Of course, the biotech part of it, working with the transgenic oxalate oxidase gene, that's going to require hundreds, if not thousands, of pure American chestnuts in order to breed enough diversity into the program and local adaptation. So we need to find more American chestnuts out there, and we're asking everybody to get out there and help. And that doesn't just mean the abundance of chestnuts we know about in the core range. We want to find those hard to find ones, those obscure ones. I'll be talking about that a lot more later on in this presentation, but I'd like to give folks tips to find chestnuts in places where you don't normally find chestnuts very easily. We also need to find American chestnuts for research. For instance, if somebody's doing a study and they want to look at the genetic component as a covariant, you would need to get multiple sources of pure American chestnut, probably from throughout the chestnut range. I needed that for my master's work up at University of Vermont. We were lucky that great members were able to go out in the wild and find chestnut trees that were flowering and get seeds and send them to us. And we did a common garden study where we looked at all sorts of different sources of pure American chestnut and studied cold tolerance among chestnuts. So a lot of people need this for research. We get requests just about every year for wild American chestnuts. There's, of course, the cultural and educational significance of this. You know, there was a time when people commonly went out to harvest nuts from chestnuts. Well, now we can go out in the woods. We could plan hikes with volunteers and go out to places where we know there's chestnuts just to study them, just to observe them. And if you're bringing a group of kids with you, you're helping get young kids excited about this so that the future of our program is there. And then, I mean, of all the things we ask people to do, this has got to be one of the most fun and interesting things we get to do. Hiking in the woods, searching for chestnuts. First of all, you're hiking in the woods, which is great. And then second of all, you're contributing to an important program. And third of all, if you find a chestnut, especially if you're in a place where chestnuts are hard to find, it's like finding a hidden treasure. There's something really exciting about being out in the woods and finding chestnut trees. So it's really satisfying. And is it COVID safe? Well, yes, it should be. Just remember a few simple basic rules. Don't carpool with people who aren't your family members. Meet at the trailhead. Have a few people go. It's nice to go with a few folks. You don't want to be out there all alone and have something happen. Although you can just let people know you're out there and let them know what your plans are so that you're safe. But if you go with a few other people, meet at the trailhead, keep your distance. Even when you're hiking on the trail, don't congregate. But with a little bit of social distancing, you can be out there with friends, you can keep it safe. And then not only is this a safe activity, but I would argue that it's a really therapeutic activity. Right now is a good time to get out of the house, get out in the woods, do some hiking, fresh air in the sun, and get a little bit of nature. It'll be good for you. Okay, next slide. So the things that we're going to talk about today, ecoregions, just throughout the chestnut range, you have different ecoregions based on unique environmental factors. As those factors vary from place to place, you'll get a slightly different ecoregion. And with that, you can predict where there will be more or less chestnuts. Well, I'm going to talk about heading for the hills. It's important to know when you're looking for chestnuts, one of the things that I'm going to emphasize is that this is an upland species. And so if you're at the bottom of the hill in a wet, marshy place or along a river bottom, you're going to want to head up the hill. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. Co-occurring species or the forest community. Knowing that you're in the right type of forest is going to be important for getting this done too. You can know you're in the right place easiest by looking at the forest around you. Accessing sites has turned out to be an important thing. As we go searching for trees, sometimes it's really easy to access a site. We drive to the trailhead and we hike up to the top of the mountain and we find chestnut trees. Sometimes, if you're in a new location, you see the mountains, but you can't get to them because the roads all run parallel to the river. So we'll talk about that, planning your route in advance so that you can access the sites you need to get to. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about TreeSnap app. Everybody should have this app on your mobile device by now, but if not, I'm going to encourage you to get it. And then we'll talk about a few other things, but why don't we jump right in and talk about all these things. So the first thing is go where you know. What I mean is look at the historic range of American chestnut, and where do you live relative to that range, or where could you get to, right? Do you know the forested places in your county or a few counties around you? You know, one thing that will help is having a little local knowledge. If you know that you're surrounded by some forest, or you know that if I head off and take this country road, I'll be in hilly country and there's hardwood forests up there, you know where to look. You know, and it might be driving along Skyland Drive or the Blue Ridge Parkway, but if you live in a place that's a little more remote, maybe you know where there's the forest that you can get to, you know about access already, you know where the public lands are, you know where it's safe and legal to go. So think about what's around you first and foremost before you go on a long road trip to someplace you've never been before. Okay, so the next thing is this map of ecoregions. This is a map that John Scrivani made, and I'll talk about what the ecoregions are a little bit more in detail, but the general crux of this is that throughout the chestnut range, you have these different ecoregions based on environmental variables. And so we represent those with these shapefiles on this map, and then color code them based on the abundance of chestnuts that would be found either historically or even what we think will be there now. So the darker colored shapefiles indicate ecoregions where chestnuts are more abundant. And then the lighter colors would be where chestnuts are less abundant, okay? Next slide. There we go. So the ecoregions, as I said, are these sub-regions within the larger ecological area. So in this case, the large ecological area is the American chestnut range from Maine to Mississippi. Within that, we have ecoregions based on things like geology, soil, precipitation, hydrology, land use too. So there's a lot of variables that go into these models. And when you take the subtle variations between these different characteristics of interest, and plug them into an algorithm, you can get different types of environments, different ecoregions. And then based on that ecoregion, based on the soil or the underlying bedrock or the amount of precipitation or how cool or the aspect or all these different things, they in turn make a site more or less suitable for American chestnut. So we know that if you're in the right ecoregion, chestnuts would do better there. Therefore, historically, we're more abundant there, and therefore, we're more likely to find chestnuts there now. Alternatively, if you got to the fringes of the chestnut range, the ecoregions change. The soil becomes more sweet. It could be a limestone bedrock, or it could be clay in the soil, or it could be, you know, a wetter site, or for whatever reason, it's not as good of a habitat for chestnut. And although chestnuts may be there, they're not as plentiful, and so now it's going to be harder to find chestnuts in those sites. That doesn't mean we're going to direct you to the tops of the mountains where the chestnuts were the dominant tree. On the contrary, we're going to ask people to go out to the places where chestnuts were rare in the first place and ask you to go find those last few hidden gems. Okay, next slide. So for an example, we have some places where we know there's lots of chestnuts, like in the dissected Appalachian Plateau. There are a lot of chestnuts there. They're sometimes harder to find, actually. We've driven around southern West Virginia, and you have to be in the right place to find them, but when you get to the right place, they're definitely there. We tend to find even more in the northern sandstone ridges of Northern Virginia, and when we find them in that location, it's not only lousy with chestnuts, but they're big chestnuts too. Alternatively, you can be in the northern outer Piedmont, which is where I'm at right now. I am on the transition zone between the Appalachian Mountains and the Piedmont. And so I'm actually at low elevation, only 500 feet. but because this country is hilly, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and because I'm in the right ecosystem, and we'll talk about that in a minute, I'm in a place where I would predict I might find 1 or 2 chestnuts. But you can see based on the tanness of that ecoregion, it wasn't a place that was abundant with chestnuts. And so even though I like my odds of finding a chestnut here, there's only going to be a couple at best. It's going to be hard to find them, but that doesn't mean impossible. So I'm here to search. Okay, next slide. So as we use our information from the ecoregions, we set out to find chestnut trees in places where we hadn't previously had a lot of recorded data on American chestnuts. West Virginia is one of those places where we use ecoregions to help us search for chestnuts. We got volunteers and some really key members in that state to start helping us find chestnut trees and record them in TreeSnap. So you'll see that there's those black X's. Those are TreeSnap entries. And you can see some places where there's lots and lots of X's in one little location or another. As you move up and down, and you also see that all of our TreeSnap entries predominantly run along the Appalachian Mountains. Of course, that's where there's more chestnuts. They're easy to find there. Those red dots are FIA data. So the forest inventory folks found chestnuts out there as you move into the other ecoregions where chestnuts might be more challenging to find. They're still there. And you see up in the northwest sort of quadrant of the state, neither TreeSnap entries nor FIA data. Nonetheless, that little sub-region of the state is in the chestnut range. So the question is, can we find chestnut there? You know, if we haven't found them before and the FIA folks didn't find them before, are they there? Well, we're sending our intern out there this very day. Before I got on this call, my West Virginia intern called me to ask for some more tips as he heads out there looking for chestnut trees. Well, I'll share some tips with you today so that if you find yourself in the chestnut range, but in a place where chestnuts are few and far between, here's some tips that'll help you with your search. One of the first tips is don't give up. Keep searching until you find the tree. It might take hours. But here's another tip. I call it head for the hills. Next slide, Sarah. Do I still have, oh, okay. I thought I lost you. Geez, I hope I don't lose you. You know, being out in the woods, there is this scary proposition. I might be out here talking to myself for like 5 or 10 minutes and not realize like I dropped the signal. Okay, so basically, this just shows you, we calculated the elevation of all the TreeSnap and FIA spots where we found chestnut trees. And notice that when you get lower in elevation, and this is more for the western slope of Chestnut Range, but it's really everywhere. As you get lower in elevation, the numbers of chestnuts really drop off. Again, it's not impossible. There's chestnuts out there, but they're few and further between. As you go up into the Appalachian Mountains and get high up in elevation, you know, there's a dramatic increase in the number of chestnuts. And once you get up in those Appalachian Mountains, you know, this is to a point. You can get too high up. We know that there's a point where the numbers drop off again. But if you get high up in the Appalachian Mountains and you're in the right forest type, you're likely to find lots of chestnut trees. You know, it's those ones that are in lower elevations where they're rare. So it's not just elevation though. My first tip for you is to head for the hills, meaning if you're hiking around looking for chestnuts and you have a choice between walking along a river bottom on a trail that borders the river, and it is a wet site with lots of moss and carpets of ferns, and you're surrounded by hills, take that trail that heads up into the hills, get away from the river and get uphill. You're more likely to find chestnuts when you go up the hill. Even if you're not going up in elevation significantly, you're going to find more chestnuts up where it's a drier site. Dry to a point, of course, but get away from the wet sites and get upslope because chestnut is an upslope species. I had yeah.
Sorry to interrupt here, but I had Doug Gillis ask a question because you use the acronym FIA, and because we're still on this map, he wonders what is FIA and how do you get access to those databases?
FIA is Forest Inventory Analysis. These are surveys that are done by both state and federal Forest Service. And these data, I think these are federal forest inventory data. But and I got these from John Scrivani. It's actually hard to get. They don't usually publish these data because they like to keep their data secret. And if you can get access to the data, the GPS coordinates are fudged. So you would have to actually get permission to get the data or know somebody who can get it. In my case, these came from John Scrivani, who was able to access the data. So unfortunately, it's not super easy to get FIA data, but not impossible. You just have to talk to some people and try to get the data sets. So yeah. So anyway, but we were able to get it. John Scrivani got it, and we used it to create this map and look at, and he used that actually to develop those ecoregions, to look at the abundance of chestnut in the ecoregions. That was based on FIA data. Okay, so the bottom line though was to go upslope, or at least be in hilly country. Where I'm at, there's not really mountains because I'm down from the mountains. I'm on the border of the Piedmont, but it's hilly here. And I know, as somebody who mountain bikes these trails, it's really hilly. But anyway, when I'm hiking around these trails, I will sometimes get to the bottom of the hill where it's really wet and muddy and carpets of fern. So then I just head up slope, and within even, 10 or 20 meters, the forest composition can change dramatically, and I can be in a drier site. So if it's wet where you are and you have the option to go upslope, go upslope. Okay, so as we talk about community types, here's two examples of two different community types. And you might encounter these, just a mere, like I said, meters apart. Indeed, these two pictures I took were about 10 meters apart. On the picture on the left, you can see a drier oak hickory site. It's dominated by oaks and especially chestnut oaks. And on the other site, I just walked down that hill about 20 meters to the creek edge, where the soil suddenly get very wet, and you see a lot of ferns growing, and you can just tell it's a wetter site. You don't need a moisture meter. You don't need to dig a profile hole. You don't need to do chemical analyses to tell you if you're in the right site or not. I'm going to give you some tips to identify the best sites today, just based on the forest community around you. So next slide, please. There we go. Okay, so this is what you're looking for. You're looking for a dry oak hickory site. These sites will have moist but well-drained soils. That means not super wet or mesic, and not actually super dry either. They could be drier. They're called dry forests, but you can have too dry of a forest. And I've encountered that before when I went looking for chestnuts. And I went to a site that was just really steep, and the soil was very rocky and gravelly, and it was very good. I mean, it's direct southern exposure. And a lot of the co-occurring species that I'm going to list here were there, but there was no mosses. There wasn't any ferns. There wasn't a lot in the understory. The trees were really spread out. It was a really thin canopy, and it was dry. And I searched for about an hour and couldn't find chestnuts. And I decided to go to the other side of the hill, where I got a little more of a southeast, maybe east exposure, and things cooled off. The soils were a little bit more loamy, and a little bit more fern and moss in the understory, and then I found chestnuts. So there is a point where it could be too dry, but it definitely doesn't. You definitely don't want it to be too wet. Typically, these will be hilly sites or mountainous sites, slightly acidic soil. Don't worry about testing the pH while you're out. You'll know from the community whether you're in the right site or not. And typically, this is an upland species. So again, head up the hill and find this sort of a dry oak hickory forest type. You're looking predominantly for chestnut oaks. Chestnut oak is probably one of the most common species to occur alongside chestnut, and they tend to like the same environment. So if there's chestnut oaks there, you're probably in the right soil and climate. Other oaks will be there too, white oaks, red oaks. Certainly there's going to be hickory. There's going to be sometimes sassafras. There will be white pine. I see a lot of sourwoods growing with chestnuts, and they fool me when I'm driving in my car looking for chestnuts. The sourwoods fool me a lot. When I'm hiking, it's the beech that fool me, and when I'm driving, it's the sourwoods that fool me. We find a lot of mountain laurel with chestnuts, sometimes blueberries. Blueberries certainly like the same sites as chestnuts. I just don't always see blueberries when I see chestnuts, but I almost always see chestnut oaks. So when I see chestnut oaks, I tend to think I'm in the right environment. Now I'm going to condition everything I just said by saying sometimes the exact opposite of everything I said will be true. You might find chestnuts along a riverbank. You might find them down in pure clay soil in the Piedmont. You might find them, you know, and find none of these co-occurring species growing next to the chestnut. But as a general rule of thumb, this is the forest type where you're going to find chestnuts. So look for this and you'll find chestnuts. And if you find this, keep searching until you find the chestnut. Don't give up, it's there. Next slide, please. Some quick examples of places where you're unlikely to find chestnuts would be these wet places like rich cove forests, river bottoms, hollows. And then of course, low elevation Piedmont. Yes, there were chestnuts in the Piedmont. And there's an argument that most of the chestnuts were wiped out by phytophthora. And that's true. But Piedmont tends to be very clay soil, and chestnuts don't love clay soils. So chestnuts were in the Piedmont and can still be found in the Piedmont, but they're fewer and further between. So you may not find a lot of chestnuts. Now I'm going to condition that with saying, I actually want you to go to some places where chestnuts are hard to find and find them. But the community types that typically dominate these more mesic sites will be red maples, birches, basswood, ash, locust, swamp oak, sweet gum, and ferns. And I'm going to say put a condition on ferns and say you're going to find them in both locations, actually, but use ferns as an indicator. How? Next slide. Sometimes you're going to find species, forest species in good chestnut sites and poor chestnut sites. So they're not really helping you that much. Red maple is a great example. When you find chestnuts, you're always going to find red maple, you're always going to find beech, you're always going to find poplars, and you're always going to find ferns. The problem is that you will be in a poor site or a mesic site where you're not going to find chestnut, and you're still going to find all those same species. The difference is that when you're in a good site, the oaks are more dominant than the red maples. And when you're in a wet site, the maples will be more dominant than the oaks. Similar with ferns, I like to use ferns as an indicator. When I'm in a good chestnut site, I definitely see wood ferns and Christmas ferns, you know, but they're just, you know, there's just a few of them sort of spread out in the dry forest. When I get to a mesic site, like you saw in that last picture, you see a carpet of ferns. And when the site's that rich and it's just, you know, a carpet of ferns, it's probably too wet for chestnuts. Then I wanted to throw in a quick thing about invasive species. I've been to sites where I thought I would find chestnuts, and we took these Boy Scouts out once on a chestnut hike to show them chestnuts. So we went to a place that I'd sort of in advance looked at some maps and said, that'll be a good place. You know, it's in the right ecoregion and it's high elevation, and, you know, we just find the forest and it'll be a good site. And when we got there, what I noticed was there was a distinct lack of oaks and hickories, and there was a lot more maple and you know, pines and birches, and there was lots of invasive species, particularly tree of heaven. I mean, the tree of heaven was everywhere. And what I realized is the native forest trees were early successional species, and then there was a lot of invasives as well. And you know what that told me was this is a previously disturbed site. It turned out to be an old strip mine. They had stripped the land, put it back, and let it turn into a forest. And all the early successional species came in, and so did the tree of heaven and autumn olive and vines and all the other things that like to take advantage of disturbed sites. Certainly no chestnuts, and we didn't spend more than 5 minutes at that site. When we saw what it looked like, we kept moving. We got in our car, we drove about another mile, maybe only went 500 to 1,000 feet further up in elevation, and suddenly we saw the composition of the forest change. We saw oaks, we saw hickories, we saw the old age trees, the slow moving ones. We didn't see a lot of invasives anymore. I didn't see any tree of heaven. We stopped there and the place was crawling with chestnuts. We found hundreds of them. We just had to be in the right community. So it's really important to look at the species that are growing where you're looking. Even when you're in a remote place, when you're out on the outskirts, on the fringes of the chestnut range, if most of that area is a lot of lowlands and mesic sites and clay soils, look for the hills. Get up in the hills and then look for these dry, hardwood species, hardwood communities like oak hickory forests. If you can find little patches, little islands, that's where the chestnuts will be. That's where we want you to look. okay? So you can go up into the Appalachian Mountains and easily find them. But if you're willing to go to places where they're hard to find, remember these tips. Remember to find those hills and then go find the oak, hickory, dry forest types. And that's where we want you to look. Okay, next slide. Okay, just a quick bit on planning your route. Now, if you know exactly where you're going, you know which forest, you know where the trailhead is, you know the trails, well, go for it. But I've run into problems before where I went traveling around southern West Virginia with John Scrivani, a place where it should have been lousy with chestnuts, but we couldn't find any because we were driving on roads that were running along the rivers. So all we saw was this river bottom community. We didn't see any chestnuts there, and we could see the hills all around us, but we couldn't find any ways to get up into the hills. And we also, it seemed like a lot of private property and we didn't have permission to go to a lot of these places. We found one place that looked like an old Forest Service road that we pulled over. We hiked for a long time to get up to the top of that mountain. And then we searched for a while and we did find a chestnut up there once we got up in elevation. But it was sort of a wasted effort because we didn't plan ahead. It was an excursion. In my defense, we spent the last previous days going to sites that we had pre-planned and found lots of chestnuts. And then we decided to head into this part of southern West Virginia sort of impromptu. And we didn't find anything. We found the one sample. So I went back a couple days later and I decided to search in this area around Beckley. I used Google Earth to look at the sites that I was interested in. I found mountains, I looked at elevation, and I looked for places with roads that look like I can access them from country roads, public lands. I found one, it was at a cell phone tower. I went to places where I could easily get to, where I could drive and be at the tops of the mountains. When I went back this time, I went to several of these points. I didn't go to all of them, but I went to several of these points and I found chestnuts at every one of them. So it was a big difference because I planned in advance. So I did this using Google Earth, which anybody could get for free. You just download it onto your computer, check it out, play with it a little bit, drop a point where you're interested in looking. Next slide. And when you do that, you can collect some data. Get the name of the location, the GPS coordinates, the elevation, leave yourself some columns, collect data when you're there. Don't forget to tree snap it. We'll talk about that in a minute. But once I figured out where I wanted to go, I made a little spreadsheet, and then I was able to plug those GPS coordinates into Google Maps. Next slide, please. And when I did that, I was able to create a route. I put all these into Google Maps and then sent it to my phone, and I had a route in my phone. When I went to go out here, it took my phone, my GPS on my phone, took me from one location to the next. When I got there, I'd search around for, I don't know, but average an hour, find a tree, get my sample, record it. I went back this winter and I got scions from these trees that we're grafting with now. So it's just a kind of a smart way to plan your route, especially if you don't know exactly where you're going. Sort of plan it out in advance. It might save you some time and trouble. Okay, next slide. So here it is, Tree Snap. Everybody on this call should have Tree Snap by now. But if you don't, get it. You can get it, it's free. Just download it from your apps. If you have a mobile device that uses apps, then you should have this app. Get this app, download it to your phone, and when you go out looking for chestnut trees, use it. This little image on the right side of the screen is what's going to come up. You can see that you can put in data for American chestnut as well as some other imperiled trees. So if you really want to go out and help these folks, look for all these trees and record data on all of them. But mostly we want you to go after American chestnut. So when you click on that button that says American chestnut, you'll get the screen that's on the left side of the page, which allows you to enter data. Let me draw your attention to the very first one that says photos. That acts as your camera and allows you to take pictures of the tree. When you do that, it automatically downloads the GPS points and assigns an accession number. We need those. We want those GPS points. They're very accurate. And so that helps us. When you take pictures of your tree or your seedling or whatever it is, please take several pictures. I want to see the tree. I'd love to see somebody standing next to the tree just for, a little reference. But what I really want to make sure is that, is that a black bear coming? Okay, no, let's see. Somebody's out there in the woods. I think it's a black bear. We've had a black bear in these woods a lot lately. Everybody keeps seeing it. Anyway, please take pictures of the leaves. I want pictures of the fronts and backs of the leaves. This is going to help us identify it. We go through the entries in TreeSnap periodically, and we want to see that what we're looking at is really an American chestnut. If we're pretty sure it is, we will send somebody out there to go see the tree, maybe get a sample from it, maybe a leaf tissue sample or scions or something. So it's important for us to be able to identify it, and so we need pictures of the leaves. Okay, next slide. Trying to wrap, I'll just wrap this up and say that we've been doing these fun training hikes where we get together with a lot of volunteers, with Boy Scouts, with anybody who wants to go out and track down chestnut trees. We'll go out to trails where we know we're going to find chestnut trees. We go hike around, we find trees, and we have a lot of fun. It's a great way to get people involved and get them excited about this. So you can't do it this year because of COVID-19. Though I think we're going to talk about doing something virtual, a virtual version of this, where we teach you Chestnut ID and how to use TreeSnap, etc. But hopefully by next year, you guys can plan chestnut hikes and take out new people and show them how to find chestnut trees and how to identify them. Next slide. Among the things we do is, well, it's a fun activity to get people involved. We go over Chestnut ID. We go over how to identify the sites. Whenever we find chestnut trees, we can point out this is what a dry oak hickory forest looks like, and here's the types of things you see. And you could easily walk around any forest and see good sites and bad sites and describe them to your volunteers who are out there. And then, of course, it's an opportunity to practice with TreeSnap. And no better way to get used to using something than when you got with a group and somebody shows you how to do it. So it's been really helpful. These hikes have paid off. We've had a lot of folks who joined these hikes who have gone off on their own and found chestnut trees. A lot of those trees that we showed you in West Virginia came from this exact hike that you see in this picture. So we're pretty happy with the success of that and encourage people to do more of the same. Next picture. Just a plug for one of our trainings that we're hoping to do sometime this summer. We're not going to go over Chestnut ID right now, but I threw this picture in there just so that we could mention that we're hoping to do some sort of training where we can do Chestnut ID. When you're hiking in the woods, if you see a chestnut tree, it's probably really a chestnut tree, but maybe not. So stay tuned for this next workshop that we're going to do. And next slide. Well, the brochure, oh, there we go. There's a brochure we made that we like to hand out to people, just more of the same, encouraging people to go out and look for trees, tells people where to look, a little blurb on identification, some supplies, get TreeSnap, et cetera, et cetera. It's a great picture because it's a really nice picture of a chestnut leaf. So if you give this to people and they bring it with them, they'll actually be able to use that little picture to help them identify the chestnuts. So, okay, I think that's it, right, Sarah? Next slide.
Yeah, that's it, Tom. Thanks. So I wanted to bring up, you said, well, we usually have these training hikes. They're really amazing. I love holding them every year with various groups to get people out and walking in the woods and finding trees, teaching people how to ID. So that's a slightly different thing than what we did today. And so I put together a little poll. I'm going to launch that just to see how many of you guys might want a more in-depth training on ID. It would be virtual. We wouldn't do it out in the field this time, but it would go into a lot more about what does an American chestnut tree look like versus a Chinese chestnut, and maybe some of the lookalikes like beech or like Tom mentioned, sometimes even sassafras can look really similar. Sometimes hickory can look really similar because of the way the leaves hang. So we might look to having a more in-depth training for that kind of a thing. It would be separate from Chestnut Chat. And then I just want to know how many chestnut trees you might have found yourself. How experienced is everyone here on this call for how many trees folks have found. Tom, while people are filling out the poll, let me go to some of the Q&As. I wanted to echo your experience in, that kind of trying to map out a place where you might find some trees, and then, oh, Looks like you have some people on the
Hang on 1 second. Would you like to get by me? I'll get off the trail. Thanks. I thought you were a black bear. I am. I could see that. Yeah. Sorry, everybody. I'm talking to a black bear. It's the mama black bear we've been seeing. Okay. Have a good hike. Oh, and then here's a mountain biker. Hello.
So when you go out and you try to find some trees, one place that I've been looking a lot is Southern Ohio. We're trying to find places where there's not a whole lot of trees. Southern Indiana is one, Southern Ohio, Western Tennessee, Western Kentucky, these real extreme edges of the range. Those are places that we really want to find trees. And so I mapped out places that are highly suitable that I should have found trees. They really should have been there. And what had happened, kind of like your experience at the Bechtel Reserve, it was a disturbed site. And so this kind of goes back to a chat message that Frank Saielli had mentioned, that if the site has been disturbed or if it's been farmed prior to 1940, you're not going to find native trees. So it could be the right ecosystem, it could be the right ecotype, it could even have all the trees that you expect to see in association with American chestnut. But you're not going to find American chestnuts because it's been disturbed. So that land use component is a really important part when you're doing that search. And sometimes it can be really hard to know whether the land had been disturbed or used for something prior to 1940 when the blight had gone through, to know whether or not the trees had been in there. So let's see, let's get back to some questions here, Tom. Let's see, Tom, this is from Jan Lambert. Tom, I'm from Virginia. Many years ago, there was a huge chestnut tree on a remote back road in Washington, Virginia. Do you know about that tree?
Maybe. You know, your name sounds familiar to me. I think we've spoken before. And maybe not, maybe somebody else with the same last name has been in communication with me. I can't say that I know about that specific tree. I know about trees that we've either done breeding work with or trees that we've harvested American nuts from, or potentially trees that I've like specifically gone and found out myself. So I can't say that I know about that tree specifically. Although I think that there are chestnuts in Washington County, so I'm not surprised to hear about it.
Well, and what do I tell folks? I have a few questions on here about what kind of trees do we want to find. So Twig Taylor asks, wouldn't it be no, let's see, what did I want to ask? Oh, are you only interested in mature flowering trees, or are there guidelines to determining whether a specimen may be too small or blight ridden to be of interest? And I think this kind of goes along as to how do I know if you know that tree already or not. I think all those go into the same guideline where we're interested in all trees, no matter how small. And the main reason is because of their location. The latitude and longitude is the most vital part of knowing what a tree, because that holds the most amount of information for us, no matter how small it is. The more locations we can have of where trees are, we won't necessarily use that tree, but we can use it to help inform our models for either creating a model for what we call habitat suitability indices, knowing where American chestnuts live currently and where we can best plant trees for best survival. And then we can also help better inform our prediction models. So we have a few models that we can use, like Tom said, we try to figure out where we're going to find trees. The more actual sites of American chestnuts we have, the more latitude and longitude and coordinates we have, the better we can make those models predict where trees are. So then also, even if we know about a tree, even if we have it in our database, getting updated information about that tree is vital. So we take like year-to-year observations on some trees. We can track that information. So, you know, if you go and you find that tree and you take its diameter, you take its circumference, you take its height, you see it's mostly dead, we add that observation to that tree's catalog. So we can see how these trees are growing over time, how they're dying over time. So, you know, don't worry if we have it in our database or not. We'll use that information, and don't worry how small it is. You know, we can use all of those data. All right. So
I'm just going to add to that, Sarah, while getting to the next question, that we have different ways, at least we're experimenting with different ways of collecting the germplasm as well. So incorporating the genetic material of the tree into our program. It's nice if they're flowering. But we have other ways. We're trying grafting. We might do something where we do rooted stump sprouts, if that turns out to work. So we really do want to know about all trees. Also, if we're trying to get DNA from the trees, small trees are fine.
Tom, how do we get a GPS reading from TreeSnap if there's not enough cell service?
Right, great question. You actually don't need cell service to get GPS coordinates. It's similar to when you're driving in your car and you're out of cell phone range, but your map keeps working. You can get the entry into your phone, and it will actually accurately collect the GPS coordinates. You just can't download the observation, so it will save it for you. Then later on, when you get home that night, you can download all your observations then.
And so Richard Bray mentions, I live in Maine and I've been reviewing a tool called the Maine Forest Spatial Tool at that link. That's in the Q&A if you guys want to check out that link. And so another person asked, D. Doler, and I'm sorry, I don't know your first name, but you ask, are there prediction models that are open source? So that's one, that Maine Forest Spatial Tool is one that's open source. I've made one recently available for 5 states, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Virginia, West Virginia, and Ohio. And we'll be posting a link to those along with this session. And I'm working on making some of those other models openly available so you guys can use those in trying to find trees or knowing whether or not the sites would be suitable. Let's see.
Can I add something to that too, Sarah?
Yeah,
Those tools are really valuable at sort of figuring out where you want to go search. But once you're out there, if you go to a forested area, once you're out there hiking around, you're just going to have to use your eyes and your judgment. So, just remember those 2 tips to think about getting upslope and looking for the right forest community, right? So planning your search, you'll want those tools. But when you're out there, know where to look.
A couple questions. So Carl Gallegos asks, where can one obtain the brochure that Tom mentioned? Carl, we're going to be posting that brochure along with the recording of this Chestnut chat. So Sandy, we will be recording it and it's going to be on acf.org. If you just Google Chestnut chat, you'll go to that website. It takes us a couple days to process these chats, to get it downloaded and posted on the website. So I'd say probably next Tuesday or Wednesday. Jules is on here. Jules, thank you so much for doing all you do for posting these Chestnut chats and making everything available. But that brochure that Tom put together and the recording of this program will also be available on acf.org. Tom, Robert N. Clark asks, can TACF recruit private pilots to spot American chestnut trees in bloom?
We have tried to do that before, and I guess the answer is I suppose. It's not something that I'm really doing for a couple of reasons. One is a lot of the chestnuts we're looking for aren't in bloom. They might be too small to flower, and we still want to find them. The other thing is the timing of flowering kind of varies a little bit as you go across the landscape and go up and down in elevation. And so, if you went out at exactly the right time, you might find a flowering tree in the wild. I think some folks have done things like that before, maybe with drones. So something that I would definitely be open to. If somebody else had connections or resources, I would think that would be a pretty cool thing. But in my experience, it was kind of hard to do.
Well, and Tom, I agree. I think in general it is hard to do, but the folks in Maine found the largest tree in Maine through flyovers, and while it was blooming, and I think there's a lot of capacity to do that. I think it does require a lot of advanced planning to do it, either with a drone or with a plane. But big trees that are flowering, that's a great way to find them. What it doesn't find are the smaller trees in areas that are underrepresented. And that's where you need people on the ground. So, the planes find one thing, but, people still need to go out and hike. So, Jim, you said you're a private pilot and you'd like to go out and do some aerial sources. That would be fantastic. So maybe we can work with you to try and figure out how we can facilitate that.
And get good at it.
Yeah.
Try it a few times and figure out the tricks to making it work. Another thing, keeping with the positive note about this, perhaps remote sensing would be helpful, because that doesn't rely on flowering trees. It would sense, whatever the magnetic imaging resonance that that particular species is giving off. It might be another way to find trees, even when they're not flowering.
Yeah. Doug Gillis asks or requests that we address the use of binoculars, tags to mark trees for scienwood, bags to collect samples. Do you want to talk about that, Tom? You're muted, Tom.
Sure. So binoculars really help, especially if you're out there when the trees are flowering. And we've definitely gotten up on top of ridges and looked down across the landscape and spotted trees that were flowering using binoculars. So similar, I guess, to the idea of using a plane or a drone. If the trees are flowering, it helps. As far as supplies you want to bring, that brochure has a list of them. I have supplies with me right now. And while we've been talking, as you know, I've been hiking around in the woods, looking at this, this beautiful dry oak hickory forest. And I have found a chestnut tree and I'm standing next to it. When we get off this call, I'm going to tree snap this little tree. It's a tiny seedling. And then I have with me, I have some flagging for flagging the tree. I'm not actually going to flag this one because it will be easy to come back and find. But the reason why Doug recommends bringing flagging with you is if you go out to a remote area, even if you tree snap it and have the GPS coordinates, coming back in the winter perhaps to get scions from that tree will be difficult unless you're very good at identifying dormant chestnut trees and your GPS points are very good. Better yet, put some flagging on that tree or somewhere near that tree, and then anybody can come back and find it to do more work with it, especially in the winter when the tree's dormant, you'll be able to find it. So flagging the tree helps. If you're collecting leaf tissue samples, I have a sample kit with me. Typically, I have folks out there collecting leaf samples. I've communicated with them and I send them the kit. But what I have is a coin envelope with some desiccant packs in it. I will write on that envelope, once we get off this phone, I'm going to collect the leaf sample too. I'm going to put the desiccant in the envelope and put the leaf sample in the envelope, and then I will write the name of the tree. I'll call it Biscuit Run 1. I'll put Albemarle County, Virginia, the GPS coordinates, the tree snap ID, my name, and the date. Write it all in pencil on that envelope, leaf sample inside with the desiccant. Then I slide all of that in a Ziploc bag with some loose silica. That'll go in the fridge until I'm ready to mail it. Other things I keep with me that I have with me right now, I of course have water and snacks. I have a phone in case I get lost, my camera on my phone so I can take pictures. I have a field guide. I have my handy Peterson's field guide for eastern forests. And I could look up trees. If I see anything I'm not sure what it is, I could look it up. Handy thing to keep with you. What else do I have in here? Let me see here. I think that's about it. So bring provisions. See what's this? Oh, I keep my clippers with me. I keep some clippers with me, and I often keep a little herbicide dabber. So when I see invasive species, I could cut them down. But that's it. And I cleared it with my wife. She knows I'm out here. She knows where I'm at. So should I get lost, if I don't come home, she knows where to send the search party. Did I cover everything?
I think so. Thanks, Tom. And I wanted to, I'm sharing another map on the screen. There's a question from Roger Wilby from Maine. He says, we have good sampling of genetic diversity in our backcross orchards. Why do we need to keep looking for trees in our state chapters? And Roger, I know Tom can answer this question, but because I'm sharing this map, I just wanted to show that, you know, there's a good amount of representation from Maine. You guys have done an amazing job. Pennsylvania, we've got a majority of things, but you can see a lot of white space here in areas that are really underrepresented and unavailable currently in conservation ways, either through our germplasm conservation orchards or our current breeding orchards. West Virginia, they're doing a little bit better than what this map shows. There have been some updates to that, but Southern Ohio, Southern Indiana, a lot of parts of Western Kentucky and Tennessee still have a lot of ways to go in terms of capturing diversity. And so in terms of either diversifying any type of blight-resistant American chestnut, we really need a good amount of the range. Tom, there's another question that deals with how far outside of the range should we go. One person, let me get the name right, asks about, so Robbie asks about looking around in Arizona. He used to live in the East and grew up with chestnuts, but now lives in Arizona. Would it be futile for him to go looking And then also about Georgia, we've got Angela in Georgia who asks, should she try and find chestnuts there? So do you want to address those two locations?
Yeah, sure. So first, as far as Arizona, Arizona is way outside of the chestnut range. So typically, we're looking at that little range map. One of the first slides I showed you was a picture of the chestnut range. I guess you can see it actually right there. Um, Typically, we're looking for material within the chestnut range so that we know we're getting an actual wild chestnut tree growing in the site where it comes from, where it's adapted to. That way we know its pedigree. We know this tree came from this site. When we use it in the breeding program, we know about its genetics. We know about what, adaptation, etc. So if there was an American chestnut tree growing in Arizona, which is an unlikely place to find them, somebody planted it there. Doesn't mean we don't want to know about it. And it doesn't even mean that I guarantee we would have never want to use it. We might. But really what we're trying to emphasize is finding wild type chestnut trees. So looking in the chestnut range is what we want to encourage people to do. Georgia is definitely within the chestnut range. And not only is northern Georgia, but as you move down the state, you'll find pockets of chestnuts. So if you can sort of look at that range map and sort of to help orient you around where you might find chestnut trees, going to places in Georgia and getting, up in the hills and looking in those right forest types, you might find trees. We'd love to know about those. Those are on the fringe of the chestnut range. Those ones we consider very valuable. So Sarah, did I answer that right, you think?
You did, thank you. So let's see. For those of us in areas where chestnuts are rare, can you give any tips for quick recognition, especially of bark on small trees where leaves won't be so easily visible? Oh, did we lose Tom? Tom, are you there? Well, while we're waiting for him to do that, I will answer that question. And somebody also asked for me to make this a little bit bigger. Let me see if I can do that.
Sorry, I'm back, Sarah. Somebody tried
Okay.
calling me and it knocked me off
Okay.
the call.
Well, while I'm trying to make this map a little bit bigger, can you answer the question about how do you identify small trees? Are there traits like bark or leaves that someone might want to look for while they're out searching around?
I mean, identifying seeing the leaves is the best way. So if you get that little brochure, for instance, or if you look it up, get familiar with what chestnut leaves look like. It's the best way to know you're looking at a chestnut. The bark, it's going to vary whether it's an immature tree or a large tree. As the bark starts off, usually you're working with small seedlings that have smooth bark. It furrows as the trees get older. And unless you're really good at dendrology and can tell a species apart from the bark, it is not so distinct. But I would say one thing to look for that will help you find the larger trees is if you see burrs on the ground. Get to know what the burrs look like. Large trees will often drop burrs, and you could see those. And look up. When I'm looking for trees, I'm constantly looking down and up and down and up, because you might come across a big tree, and we see big trees a lot because we're looking at the canopy. A lot of what you're going to find, though, are little stump sprouts like this one I'm standing next to. It's tiny. And so I saw it by walking on the trail. I was looking down at around the edge of the forest down in the understory, and I saw this one. So definitely get to know what the leaves look like. It's your best chance of finding a chestnut tree, and get to know what the lookalikes look like. Get to know how American chestnut differs from beeches and chestnut oaks, for instance, so that you can be able to identify the chestnut tree when you find it. When you see it, you'll know it, I think.
Cool. Thanks, Tom. So I'm going to start wrapping up here. I wanted to give a response to the polls. I don't think you guys can see what happened in the polls, but I had 75% of folks would like to take a separate, more in-depth training on how to find trees, 17% maybe. For how many people have found lots of trees in the wild? So we've got 50% who have found 1 to 10, 40% have not found any, and the rest of us, I saw a few very familiar faces on there who I know have found a ton of them out in the wild. So I appreciate that you guys made it to this talk too. But so because there's interest, I think we will go ahead and hold a more in-depth ID, like how do you identify chestnuts and how do you find them in the wild. We'll do that a little like hiking kind of a training. We'll do that here pretty soon. One final question here that I'll take. Somebody asked, what do the colors on the map mean? The lighter the color, so if you can see the legend down here in the lower left-hand corner, yellow, orange, red, that means that very few trees in that given county have been conserved within some sort of orchard, either a breeding orchard or a germplasm conservation orchard. If it's blank, that's a county within the natural range that has not been conserved, that no trees have been conserved. And then the greens and blues is where a ton of American chestnuts, 11 plus, have been conserved through breeding or otherwise. Oh, sorry, that's my my son. He doesn't
So
want
you
to
should have gone out to the woods.
he's not tired. He doesn't want to take a nap. So, all right. So I think with that, we're gonna shut down here for the day. Thanks everybody. Tom, thank you so much for sharing your hike with us in the woods. And thanks everyone for joining us for this installment of Chestnut Chat. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Lisa to talk to us about the next session and what we're going to do next.
I didn't look at your text soon enough. Do we have something scheduled or just the date? Oh, I got it now. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We'll wrap it up quickly. Tom, excellent job. Really fun to watch you walk around in the woods and share your enthusiasm with everyone. So mark your calendars for the same time Friday, June 26th for a Chestnut Chat on either drone technology for chestnut restoration or reintroduction of chestnuts. Hi, Parker. So anyway, it'll be a really good one. We've had great participation. Thanks for all of you to come and take an hour or so out of your day to learn more about chestnuts and stay re-engaged with our programs. Thanks to all of you and have a great weekend.